This is Series 3 of Away, a podcast for anyone exploring change through sobriety. I'm your host, Steph Roberts. This is episode 2 of Series 3. Hello, listeners, lovely listeners. I have been very sick over the past week, just a cold, but combined with terrible, this is TMI, but a terrible period, which I've always had. And I have to take iron supplements, and the two combined just knocked me on my ass. So I apologize for the long wait, and as if you've been waiting with bated breath. That sounds a little egotistical. My dog Uma is here with me, looking very unhappy that I'm doing this. My husband is watching the final episode ever of Game of Thrones for a second time, so I decided to do this. In the intro to the first episode, I mentioned that I wanted to talk about shame, or more to the point, I guess, guilt versus shame. And as I said in the intro to episode 1, maybe I'm wrong to use the word shame. Like when I say, let shame be a motivator, something I repeatedly say in the last series. I was listening to a lot of Brené Brown, and she says the word we should use is guilt, not shame. Guilt as a tool for self-correction. And I totally agree. Her point, I think, is that shame is associated with a pattern of thinking and guilt with another. That is my dog. So I guess shame decreases self-worth, because with it we often think things like, I'm a bad person. Guilt, on the other hand, is more often associated with bad behavior, which you know is what I think of most of us, that we were badly behaved, never bad people. So we feel guilty for behaving badly, but that's not as heavy as shame. Guilt maybe feels correctable where shame doesn't. I'm actually trying to work this out in my head now. When I use the word shame, I'm thinking mostly of feeling ashamed of myself for certain behavior. So I guess I don't feel a need to differentiate between the two words. I've already assigned the feeling of shame to negative behaviors, negative ways in which I've treated myself and others. At this point in my sobriety, in my life, really, I no longer use shame to punish myself. And I certainly try not to use it as a tool to punish others. More often than not, for me, it's the recollection of the feeling that I use to correct behavior. But listening to Brené Brown and Mark Maron talk about it, I realize this may be kind of discomforting language for some people. So I guess I'm urging you to replace the word shame when I use it or say it, like let shame be a motivator, with the word guilt. You may identify with still other words: regretful, remorseful, humbled. The way I use the word shame in this podcast and in previous ones should be likened to guilt and associated only with behavior. Here's a personal example. When I was drinking, not only when I was drunk, mind you, I was very judgmental of others. Mostly, I kept it to myself. On a few occasions, I gave voice to it. Not proud. On one such occasion, I was nasty to a colleague. I made a disparaging remark about her husband in front of a group of people. Her husband wasn't there. It wasn't until I was sober a few years that another colleague reminded me of the evening. I say reminded, but I really mean told me, because I was pretty much in a blackout most of that night. He said that this woman had been really wounded by my words, so much so that she had cried. I was mortified, but I also had my defenses up when he told me, and I doubled down and went into a tirade about how scary and controlling her husband appeared to be. I tried to excuse the behavior because the feeling of shame at the time was too uncomfortable. It's been another few years now, and I know without a shadow of a doubt that I was wrong to say what I said in the first place. I may not have been able to change the first thought, but I was able, or should have been able, to control the next thought or action. And I was also really wrong to double down later. She didn't know that, but it still wasn't right. It isn't the wrongness in and of itself that keeps me from doing it again. It's that feeling of humiliation I felt when I was reminded of my behavior. And again, the feeling of humiliation after I doubled down. That felt terrible. Just talking about it now, I feel deeply ashamed of myself for saying something that could wound someone else in such a way. She was not a best friend, not even a friend really, a colleague. It was none of my fucking business. And, it's only now that I understand why I did things like that, my own discomfort, my own feeling of worthlessness. But while that's a reason for it, it is not an excuse. The fact is, I never have to feel any guilt or shame like that again. And it's as simple as never making someone else feel that way again. I can use that feeling of shame to motivate me to always do better. I don't mean re-feel it, but bring up the sense of it, the feeling tone, so to speak. There's a difference in my experience between the perception of an emotion and the experience of it. And I'm not sure I'm adequately explaining what I mean. It's hard to articulate. If you're someone who meditates, you may identify more easily with the idea of a feeling tone. In the absence of that, I can only really use the very unoriginal slogan you hear a lot in recovery: respond, don't react. Try to identify the feelings around the emotion itself. Take a minute, take a breath. What is the judgment? What's the real feeling? So when you sort of figure out the sensation or tone of the emotion, then you can do something with it, something positive or productive, or not do something, as the case may be. I wish I had more literate language than this. As I said, I don't have any degrees. I'm not a doctor. This is just experience. But the idea is that I can't change my first thought or emotion. So if I'm sitting at dinner with some friends and I think something nasty like, should Cara really be eating all that bread and butter? Rather than saying that out loud, I can use the same amount of energy it would take to say something mean and instead summon the tone of shame, which means I can absolutely change my next thought or action. I just have to take a minute. I really hope that makes sense. Being mean makes me feel like shit, and it will make someone else feel like shit. And it may therefore affect numerous others still. But I never have to feel worthless again because I never have to feel real shame again, as long as I can hang on to the tonality or sensation of the raw emotion. That's not to say I won't. It's just that I don't have to. I do have a choice. It's a choice between an old behavior and a new behavior. I know that if I behave in that old way, I will feel those horrible feelings. And if I behave in this new way with thoughtfulness and compassion, mindfulness, I will not only feel good about myself and therefore raise my own self-worth, but I won't hurt someone else. So this is guilt, this is regret, this is remorse. My language works for me, but may not for you. So when I say let shame be a motivator, I think you can replace shame. Let guilt be your motivator. Let the memory of anguish be your motivator. I think that the questions to ask yourself when you feel a sense of guilt, shame, or remorse are, what have I done to bring about this feeling? Is there something I can do right now to correct myself and alleviate this feeling? And either way, what can I change about my behavior going forward in order to avoid feeling this way again? Of course, none of this touches on external sources of shame or shaming by others. That is shame used by others in an effort to, I suppose, make themselves feel better, bigger, smarter, more virtuous. I think that the way shame is being used now, like by social media, social justice warriors, is unhelpful at best for anyone, but especially for people pursuing a better life through sobriety. I'd advise never using it in an effort to help anyone but yourself. Shaming others is not a tool for a better life. As they say in recovery, your job is to keep your side of the street clean. If you're like me, and I know I'm not unique, as I said, I can be judgmental. Mean thoughts do still occur to me. Of course they do, especially when I feel vulnerable. For me, feeling vulnerable feels like, like I'm being cornered. And when I'm cornered, I'm personally a fighter, not a flighter. So my first thought is often something mean-spirited, something that will bring the other person down, so to speak. The thing is that whether it's my hard wiring as an animal or my training as a human or some of both, I'm not sure the root cause is what matters, the vulnerability. I have an idea of whence my reactions came, but that knowledge alone was not what prompted me to change. I say all this because I'm going to say something that may be a little uncomfortable. I don't judge myself or hate myself or shame myself for even the meanest of thoughts. I'm not a psychopath. I'm not sure a real psychopath would be able to judge his own thoughts. Anyway, as long as I can see the thought, so to speak, going through my mind, then I can change what happens next. My next thought or action is within my control, even if the first thought isn't. I find it totally unhelpful to shame myself for something that is ultimately out of my control. It's what I say or do afterwards that matters. So the moment I notice the nasty, I can stop, take a breath, summon the sensation of shame, and immediately change my next thought, word, or action. More often than not, I keep my mouth shut and consider how I feel. Why am I thinking this? Is it even deserved, or am I maybe unhappy or uncomfortable? Bad behavior, in my experience, leads to feelings of shame, and feelings of shame lead to feelings of worthlessness. In order to stay sober and have a relatively contented existence, I can't afford to feel worthless. This is kind of what the big book says in AA, but in really difficult, really bad, really antiquated language. They talk about resentments and pride. For me, it's worthlessness. For me, feeling worthless is more dangerous than any other feeling. Anger, anguish, neither have the same effect on me. Feeling worthless brings with it feelings of loneliness, futility, emptiness, distrust, jealousy, paranoia. 4 horsemen, it's like a million. For most of my life, that feeling, accompanied by anxiety, was what I used alcohol, cocaine, money, men to medicate. And I suppose for a while it worked. In the absence of any other medications, I believe that those things actually saved my life. I'm not sure I would have had the will to live without them. But of course, none of those things is a long-term solution. And in the end, they all lead back to shame and therefore a sense of worthlessness. Vicious cycle indeed. Okay. I guess I'm talking about this because it's all a part of the same mental illness for me. A tangle of so many strings that to untie the knot seemed impossible. But I'm telling you it wasn't. It wasn't. It wasn't impossible, and it wasn't even as difficult or uncomfortable as I'd expected. And while I'm now bound by different ties, by new things, none of them carry with them the tone or sensation of shame. Okay, with no real segue here, I did want to mention an email I got from a listener. She lives in the Southwest, and she's coming back. For non-AAs, that means she was sober, then went out to do a little more research, i.e. drink for a little longer, and then she came back, which is really wonderful and isn't always true for everybody. Whether it's AA or not a lot of people come back to recovery for the long term. She is an atheist and a feminist, I'm happy to say, and was really grateful for the podcast, and I was so grateful to hear from her. I love it, because the only reason I'm doing this, there's no advertising money, nobody's, I'm not making anything on this. I just want to help people who need to know there's a way through this that doesn't follow the big book word for word or the thumpers or whatever. So she emailed me because in Series 1, her first email in Series 1 mentioned possibly doing a Skype meeting or a live online meeting of some sort to delve a little further into the possibilities that exist within the big book and the 12-step program as a whole, even with all the antiquated bullshit. There was not a lot of interest at the time, some growing interest. So I'm thinking about it again. But since the interest still isn't exactly massive, I'm considering doing a YouTube live video in which you guys can ask questions or something to that effect. And not only I can answer them, we can all be involved in almost a chat. Nice Twitter. It's still just an idea, and I'd welcome ideas from listeners if this doesn't sound good or feasible or you have other suggestions. Email me, emmabliss57@gmail.com. 57 is the street I grew up in, not the year I was born. I was born in 78. Not that I care about my age. 41, love it, love getting older. Never thought that would be true. Anyway, this listener had just listened to the episode Abandon Yourself to Life, which I actually kind of took from a line in that chapter of the big book, only they used the word God, and I replaced it with life. Abandon yourself to life. And I'm also bringing this email up because she said something that really resonated with me, something I've said on the podcast before, but I really like the way she phrased it. She wrote, "I've just finished my step 5 and have felt a big shift inside that is allowing me to pause before reacting to things that would have made me drink. So it really works. It's not God that works, it's my work that works. But it works. Isn't that a wonderful quote? I love that. I love the way she phrased it. It's my work that works, but it works. And it does. Not for everyone, but for some. So if you're on the fence, just give it a try. Don't be hard on yourself if it turns out that AA is not the way for you. It's just one way. It's a way.